Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing discussion of Vietnam. In our previous lecture, we talked about the Gulf of Tonkin Incident and Resolution during Lyndon Johnson's administration and the escalation of the growing war in Vietnam in the aftermath of that resolution. In this lecture, we'll continue talking about that period in the immediate aftermath of the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution and the growing escalation of the conflict. While hindsight might make it seem different, Vietnam was not a major political issue in the 1964 presidential election. Public interest in the matter was slight at that time. American investment and losses were relatively small, and few doubted the sincerity of the government and the nobility of its purpose. In the course of the campaign, Lyndon Johnson appeared to promise that he wouldn't involve American combat troops to a land war in Asia. It is during this period that he made famous announcements such as, "We don't want our American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys. We don't want to get involved in a nation with 700 million people and get tied down in a land war in Asia." And another time he said, "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." At the same time, he continued with the no retreat, no surrender rhetoric and backed his commitment to South Vietnam. He knew that the situation in South Vietnam was deteriorating and that the possibility for further American involvement was real. But he maintained the illusion long enough to win a landslide victory over the war hawk Barry Goldwater in November 1964. Within a year, there was considerable doubt within the American public about the man they had re-elected so resoundingly. South Vietnam at that time continued in political turmoil. Between August and November 1964, coups had removed and then returned Khan to power. He then stepped down as prime minister and allowed the role to be taken by a civilian, Tran Van Huong, who was the former mayor of Saigon. He was selected by a group of young generals known as the Young Turks, of which Khan was one. They continued to rule from behind the scenes. Meantime, the Viet Cong escalated the war, and their power continued to grow as the ARVN continued weakening. The Viet Cong attacked ARVN forces, shelled airfields, and for the first time attacked a U.S. military installation, the Ben Hoa Airfield, destroying 5 B-57 bombers and damaging over 20 other planes. As 1964 came to an end, it appeared that the Communists were near to victory in South Vietnam for the third time in recent history. One was August 1945, when the Japanese occupation ended. Another was in 1954, after Dien Bien Phu and before the Geneva Accords. And now in late 1964. This time, they would be denied by increased American involvement in South Vietnam. Johnson and his advisors could not remove themselves from the path they had started down. Most of the dissenters had either resigned or been replaced. Lyndon Johnson was surrounded by voices that urged escalation. By the time of his re-election, Johnson's advisors had convinced him that bombing North Vietnam was the best action. This was the best way to interdict the men and material moving to South Vietnam, and the best way to boost morale in Saigon. There were few who doubted and complained about these objectives. One insider who objected to this course of action was George Ball, the Undersecretary of State, the number 2 man in the State Department. After his studies of Germany in World War II, he didn't think that bombing the North would be effective, and I've mentioned some of his objections under the Kennedy administration. He also warned Lyndon Johnson of the possible negative effects of the bombings. These might lead to invasion by China, or by a full-scale invasion by the North Vietnamese, or simply to the escalation and the war becoming unmanageable, which ultimately, of course, is proved true. Ball urged a political solution, and sadly, like others, he was ignored. In late November 1964, Johnson developed a plan of gradually increased bombings in the North, which would be carried out in two phases. One focusing primarily on transportation lines to weaken the forces moving south, and also in response to any attacks from the north. And two, larger attacks designed to force the North into submission. Johnson was reluctant to initiate the bombings while there were still doubts about the South Vietnamese government. There was fear that it might create cause for rebellion in the South. Johnson heard that yet another coup was underway and said, "I don't want to hear anything more about this coup shit. I've had enough of it, and we've got to find a way to stabilize those people out there." In the streets of Saigon, there were protests against the government and attacks against the United States. In the countryside, the Viet Cong continued to gain ground and continued attacks against American forces. On Christmas Eve 1964, there was a bombing of the Brinks Hotel in Saigon, where American officers were staying. There were 2 killed and 38 Americans wounded and 13 Vietnamese wounded in this attack. By early 1965, there was already a sense of war weariness setting in within the administration and certainly within South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese government was divided and falling victim to a series of coups. The international community had not backed Lyndon Johnson, and the Many Flags program had failed. They were urging a peaceful settlement to the conflict in Vietnam. And yet, despite these doubts, Johnson and his internal circle of advisors determined that escalation was the best route out of this mess. By early 1965, Johnson's advisors were encouraging him to launch the bombing attacks, even though the situation in the South was deteriorating. Perhaps they would distract attention from the political situation there, and they might succeed in weakening the North. On February 7, 1965, Viet Cong fighters fired artillery upon the American Marine base at Pleiku and a nearby helicopter base. 9 Americans died, and 137 were injured in the attacks, and 22 helicopters were destroyed. In response to that attack, Lyndon Johnson ordered Flaming Dart, a series of bombing attacks against pre-selected North Vietnamese targets. The Viet Cong attacks continued, and Johnson ordered more bombings. Within a week, the bombing runs were no longer done simply in response to North Vietnamese attacks. Quote, the administration had moved from reprisals to a continuing, graduated program of air attacks against North Vietnam. In our next lecture, we'll talk about these escalated air attacks known as Operation Rolling Thunder.